The winter of 1942 settled over Washington like a thin layer of frost quiet on the surface, but hiding the pressure boiling beneath it. Inside a dimly lit office in the War Department, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over a map spread across a long wooden table. Thin shadows from a desk lamp stretched across the coastlines of North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Western Europe. Pins, colored threads, and handwritten notes traced the shape of a world collapsing into chaos. Outside, traffic rumbled faintly over cold asphalt. Inside, the room felt sealed, heavy, and waiting. It was late past midnight, but Eisenhower was still wearing the same neat uniform he had put on at dawn. His collar creased slightly from long hours, his eyes tired but alert, his hands steady as they hovered over the decisions that would define not just the next operation, but the future of the entire Allied war effort. On the desk beside him sat a single document, freshly typed, waiting for a signature that did not belong to him. It was a proposal, a request, a challenge, and it would become the decision that changed everything. The Allies had reached a crisis point. Britain was exhausted, stretched across multiple fronts from the western desert to the skies above the Channel. The Soviet Union was bleeding at a rate no modern nation could sustain. The United States had the manpower and industry but lacked experience and cohesion. And Eisenhower, newly elevated, untested in command, and still unknown to most of the world, was suddenly caught between leaders whose disagreements threatened to fracture the entire coalition. But this night, the problem on the table was not just about strategy. It was about control. It was about whether the Allies could work together at all. And it was about whether Eisenhower, the quiet Kansan with no battlefield fame, could step into a role that demanded perfect leadership under impossible circumstances. He leaned forward, studying the Mediterranean again. The urgent question of 1942 was simple on paper but explosive in reality. Where would the Allies strike next? The British wanted North Africa. The Americans wanted France. The Soviets wanted immediate relief. Each path carried risks. Each path carried politics. And each path required a leader who could stand in the middle of a storm without being swallowed by it. That was the moment, the pressure. The crossroads. The heavy air of December 1942, where a single decision would determine whether Eisenhower would rise or whether he would be swept aside. He didn't know it yet, but what he chose in the coming days would make him unstoppable. Not because he was flawless or brilliant in traditional battlefield terms, but because he possessed a calm strength that could hold together an alliance that was already straining at every seam. The decision he would make was not written in history books as a dramatic moment. There were no speeches, no battlefield heroics, no grand declarations. It was a decision made in silence in a dim office long after most of Washington had gone home. Yet it changed the shape of the war. It set in motion the road to North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, and finally the beaches of Normandy. And it was the moment when leaders from London to Moscow began to understand that Eisenhower was becoming something rare, a commander every Allied leader, no matter how stubborn, proud, or divided, could trust. But before Eisenhower could make that decision, before he could step fully into the role history demanded of him, he had to understand the world collapsing around him. The events leading up to that winter night were not gentle. They were jagged, violent, unpredictable. The war had twisted alliances, broken nations, and forced leaders into choices they never expected to make. Eisenhower's rise was not smooth. It was shaped by failure, tension, and the grinding friction between nations fighting the same enemy but not always the same war. And so, to understand why that single decision in 1942 made Eisenhower unstoppable, we must return to the months and years that led him to that desk, that map, and that moment when the course of the entire Allied strategy shifted in the silence of a late-night room, because everything that followed torch, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the liberation of Western Europe grew from the pressure of that night, from the lessons he carried from a lifetime of preparation, and from the understanding that war is not just fought on battlefields, but in the fragile spaces between nations, personalities, and competing visions of victory. Eisenhower inhaled slowly. his gaze fixed on the map as if the coastlines themselves were whispering the future. Behind him, the room remained still. The war outside raged on, and the decision waiting on his desk, though small in appearance, would become the hinge on which the entire Allied effort would turn. As a thin draft drifted through the hallway. Shifting the papers slightly, Eisenhower reached again for the pencil lying beside the map. He straightened a few markers, traced a potential landing zone, and then paused. The decision he was forming was not just military, it was diplomatic, strategic, moral, and it demanded a kind of leadership that the world had not yet seen him deliver, but the path that led him here had begun long before this night. Years earlier, across continents, in barracks, staff rooms, training camps, and war rooms. And to understand why his 1942 choice carried so much power, we must step backward and see how the world, the war, and Eisenhower himself arrived at this crossroads, for in the months leading up to this moment, the fabric of the Allied coalition had started to tear, and the only way forward, the only path toward unity, required a leader capable of doing what no one else could. The story of why Eisenhower became unstoppable begins not with triumph, but with the pressure that forced him to rise. The world Eisenhower stepped into in 1942 was one shaped by decades of preparation, conflict, and quiet observation. From his earliest days at West Point, he had been trained not just in tactics, but in patience, organization, and understanding the human element in warfare. He understood armies as systems, not merely collections of men and weapons. He had watched, studied, and learned as the world around him shifted, noting patterns of power, politics, and failure. When the United States entered the First World War, he was young and ambitious, eager for the front lines, but instead he was assigned to training and logistics, a role that seemed mundane to peers, but would forge in him a deep understanding of how to make armies function under pressure. He coordinated tanks, equipment, and thousands of soldiers, all while the European war raged overseas. There, he learned lessons in leadership that no battlefield could teach: the quiet, steady application of planning, the art of patience, and the ability to guide organizations when everything else seemed chaotic. The interwar years were harsh, testing the mettle of every officer who remained. Funding was scarce, promotions slow, and the army itself shrank, yet Eisenhower continued, studying European tactics, coalition operations, and the evolution of modern warfare. He spent time under mentors like General Fox-Cunner, absorbing wisdom on alliances and international diplomacy, learning that commanding a coalition required more than skill with troops. It demanded understanding people, politics, and the fragility of trust between nations. As Europe teetered on the edge of another conflict, Eisenhower watched, quietly building the mental map that would later allow him to navigate one of the most complex leadership challenges of the 20th century. By 1939, Germany had invaded Poland, triggering a chain reaction that engulfed the continent. France fell in weeks, Britain clung to survival, and Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics revealed a new age of war. The United States, though still technically neutral, began a cautious mobilization. Eisenhower's experience, gained quietly through years of planning, writing, and observing, positioned him uniquely for the coming storm. He had learned to balance competing demands, anticipate challenges, and manage complexity, skills far beyond what many of his contemporaries possessed. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America entered the global conflict in full. Factories shifted to wartime production, training camps overflowed with recruits, and the army expanded rapidly. Eisenhower, now a key strategic planner under General George Marshall, was tasked with translating policy into action. Every Allied leader faced immense pressure. Churchill pushed for Mediterranean campaigns. Stalin demanded a Western front, and the American government sought to avoid overextension while proving itself. In this environment, the ability to coordinate, listen, and build consensus became more valuable than battlefield heroics. Operation Torch, the planned invasion of North Africa, emerged as the first major test of Eisenhower's coalition leadership. British commanders were wary of inexperienced Americans. The Free French forces were divided between loyalty and collaboration, and the Axis threat under Rommel was formidable. Eisenhower's skill was not in daring individual maneuvers, but in holding a fractured alliance together. He had to negotiate with generals who distrusted him, persuade political leaders with competing priorities, and plan amphibious landings across hostile terrain. The responsibility was enormous, and every decision carried weight far beyond what a single commander usually faced. The landings began in November 1942. And from the first hours, the difficulty became apparent. In Morocco and Algeria, forces met resistance that was inconsistent, confusing, and at times hostile. French units alternated between support and obstruction. German and Italian forces launched counterattacks with precision,